Some public transport companies putting profits ahead of safety. Well, we found out some are allowing drivers to leave their vehicles' engines running while they're refueling, even with a busload of passengers on board. The practice is high risk, and as Inside Story found out, it's also igniting new concerns about safety measures at petrol stations. For Hong Kong people who are behind the wheel, this is a ritual. But what's wrong with this picture is that some drivers are choosing to break the law by ignoring a basic safety precaution, and that's switching off the engine while filling up.
Any motor vehicle on the road, should its petrol cap be removed, must switch off its engine. This may occur in petrol garages, but it equally applies to any vehicle on the road.
And what's also equally applied is a fine of up to $2,000 under Hong Kong's Road and Traffic Safety Ordinance. Signs seem to be obscurely placed at some petrol stations, requesting those in the driver's seat to turn off the ignition. But for petrol workers, a request is as far as it goes.
唔係呢一間，間都差唔多啦，唔係指定呢一間㗎。對全世界都係咁㗎啦，即係我哋做生意嘅嘢，梗係唔能夠得罪啲客㗎啦，係咪啊？
By law, petrol stations and workers are under no obligation to enforce the regulation. But that leaves some complainants, lawmakers, and safety advocates fuming.
The fact that there are signs all over the petrol stations, asking people to turn off the ignition, presupposes that there is a risk that if that action takes place, then there is a danger to those using the premises. So if there is a sign there asking the drivers to turn off the ignition, then I think the first step is for the gas station operators to put that into operation.
The risk is real, and the world watched in horror when the risk became a reality at the recent German Grand Prix, when a pit stop ended in disaster.
What actually happened was there was a fuel spill, which we all saw. The fuel, being very volatile, vaporized very quickly. And when the fumes traveled backwards, they touched the hot metal, or probably the exhaust, and you got spontaneous combustion. And the flame front just rushed forward. And obviously anybody with fuel on them that could vaporize, it just set fire to it and resulted in the fireball that we saw.
Luckily, the driver and 3 crewmen escaped the fireball, but not without injuries. So petrol itself isn't really the problem, but its vapors are, when mixed with the right amount of heat, oxygen, and some believe inexperience.
通常都係有一個人指揮㗎，指揮又點入啊咁樣啊，有好多唔明㗎嘛，咪教佢入咯。
And the Grand Prix disaster, some believe, is also a lesson to be learned. Can something like that happen in Hong Kong?
It could do. It's like anything. The whole point of the regulations as concerns filling stations is to try and minimize the fire risk.
But as we discovered, most of the drivers for one minibus company are unafraid of the risks and the rules of filling up, even with passengers on board.
我哋冇理由叫佢落車先㗎嘛，係咪啊？要佢個小巴揸車啊，咁樣啊，佢可以落晒客嚟日日都得㗎，係咪啊？
When Inside Story tried to ask them why they're operating this way, many refused to speak to us. Well, and the ones who did, they say they're doing it for the comfort of their passengers.
俾你坐車坐開冷氣車啊，陣間熄晒啊，咪好熱㗎。揸車唔驚嘅，你電油車先驚啫嘛。油車好難着火嘅，電油先易着火。
Well, I think all transport operators, particularly those who provide a service to the public, should have the safety and convenience of the public as the most important consideration. And if minibus drivers who have a load full of passengers on board do have the need to go into a gas station to refill their tanks, then I believe at least they should have safety in mind and turn off the ignition.
Well, Inside Story found out that for some drivers, comfort isn't the only consideration. We went for a ride, and that's when drivers who didn't know the camera was rolling were more than forthcoming with their reasons. Well, we went to the company's office to find out more. The company's chairman, who's also running for this month's district board elections in Sai Kung, defends the driver's unorthodox habit.
We have to look at the minibus central stop and how far it is from the petrol station. If it's too far, most likely the procedure will be different.
By the way, the petrol station the minibuses frequent for filling up is just a few minutes away from the central stop. Nonetheless, it was also disclosed that the drivers are on a very tight schedule. It's something the company is not anxious about changing.
On this point, the Green Line minibus is different because you are on a fixed schedule. But if we take an empty bus to fill up, that may ruin the schedule.
And some drivers argue that most minibuses run on diesel fuel, which is much more difficult to ignite. That conclusion, though, is also drawing fire.
They're being incredibly silly, apart from the fact that they're breaking the law, because they will say, well, we have a diesel vehicle, so therefore diesel being less volatile, it doesn't matter. But it's the petrol fumes from other users. A running engine provides a source of ignition on several counts. One is the pure heat produced by the engine and the exhaust. And a stationary engine, the exhaust will get very, very hot indeed.
So why do many drivers in general so brazenly break the law? Well, you may be surprised to learn, as Inside Story was, that for the whole of Hong Kong so far this year, only one person has been ticketed for breaking that law. Now, if you're wondering how that stacks up to last year's figures, it's the same. Now, police say, though, the problem of enforcing the law isn't so much the issue of manpower, but the lack of involvement by the public. The law has plenty of teeth, but it doesn't even have much of a bite, with an estimated 800 traffic officers to cover the streets of Hong Kong. But police are counting on citizens to hopefully change that.
We normally rely on information from the public with the number of vehicles and indeed the number of petrol stations in the colony. We don't patrol them as a matter of course and would normally rely on information from the public.
But is there any point in having this regulation, or should it be overhauled?
Whether or not we need to go into legislation on this sort of activity, of course, we have to look at whether it's very prevalent, whether it can be done by way of administrative measures, or we can ask the operators to put it through some regulations, rather than legislation, because I don't believe that we can legislate on all minor details.
I don't think there's any need for stiffer penalties, as it is an adequate deterrent, but further enforcement, if we do receive complaints from the public, would, I think, have an effect.
Well, no matter how the problem is going to be tackled, one thing is certain. The potential for a disaster is there whenever drivers leave the petrol cap off while the engine is on.